Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming to this discussion about 4 Chicago artists, which will not be a lecture, but just a kind of casual, informative, we hope, discussion about our research and the findings of that research and the celebration of these 4 fantastic artists. My name is Mark Pascale. I'm a curator in the Department of Prints and Drawings. And tonight, I'm delighted to welcome colleagues Kathryn Cua and Stephanie Strother, who helped put this show together and did the lion's share of the work, and were delightful to work with. And it's their show, and I will, after I introduce them, I will be shutting up for the most part. The 4 artists in this exhibition, Ted Halkin, Evelyn Statsinger, Barbara Rossi, and Christina Ramberg, were all colleagues of mine. I knew them all during their lifetimes. I taught with several of them. And I have worked for 25 years to try to bring more of their work into the museum's collection. And I want to get a little housekeeping done before I introduce Stephanie and Kat more formally, to thank the many people who made this possible, because it was great generosity. The Statsinger-Cohen Foundation, thanks to Danny Schulman and David Selmer, who directed tremendous financial support that allowed me to hire these wonderful young scholars to work on this exhibition. Thank you so much. And for gifts of Evelyn's work, so much of it, gracing the walls of the Art Institute. The Kohler Foundation, who I've worked with for several years now, made it possible for us to have a really deep dive into Barbara Rossi's work in all media. Sylvia and Daniel Halkin, Ted's children, opened up his paper drawers to me, and with help from George Liebert, a great artist in his own right, and a dear friend who led me to a very specific and narrow frame of reference in Ted's work, I was able to cherry pick many of the drawings that you see in the exhibition. Sam and Helen Zell gave 2 wonderful exquisite corpse drawings towards right as we were finishing up labels, when they realized what we were doing, or Helen realized what we were doing, and she made a couple of her wonderful items available to us as gifts. Surprisingly, for some people perhaps, Vera Burdick, a name that might come up again tonight, who was a professor of printmaking at the School of the Art Institute for many, many years, and was Barbara Rossi's mentor. Barbara, in fact, replaced her during a sabbatical in the early 70s. Alex Hansen, Christina Ramberg's son, gave 2 extremely rare and important sketchbooks to the museum, one of which is in the 4 Artists exhibition, and one of which is in the Christina Ramberg retrospective over in the Modern Wing. And someone who is not with us anymore, George Danforth, an architect who was a draftsman for Mies van der Rohe, and gave 2 of Evelyn's most important drawings to the Art Institute's collection. He was a wonderful guy and terrific to work with. So I want to thank them all up front, and so many other people who helped us, who encouraged us, and sustained us. And now to my colleagues. Stephanie Strother specializes in modern art of the 19th and early 20th centuries. She holds a Master of Arts degree from the Courtauld Institute in London and is currently working towards her PhD in art history at the University of Chicago. Her dissertation focuses on, don't make fun of me for this, the Atelier Martin, a Paris-based decorative arts workshop founded in 1911 by a leading fashion designer, Paul Poiret. I'm an American. I can't say it. Kathryn Cua is the curatorial assistant for the Asian American Arts Initiative at the Cantor Art Center of Stanford University. She completed her dual MA in art history, theory and criticism, and arts administration and policy at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Both of these scholars have distinguished work histories with the Art Institute as interns and in other capacities, and I was fortunate indeed to be able to work with them again on this exhibition. Please join me in welcoming them to the stage. Let's start.
Shall we begin?
We're going to start with some pretty basic questions that I hope will just get you going, and we won't have to ask too many questions. First and foremost, could you please talk about how this exhibition came together? What was the impetus and extras?
Would you like to start?
Okay, sure. As Mark mentioned in his introduction, one big reason that we wanted to undertake this exhibition was all the incredible and very generous recent gifts to the museum that we were able to highlight. It was fantastic to be able to put this stuff on the walls and remind people of just how rich and vibrant our permanent collection is and constantly growing and changing. I was primarily responsible for working on the Barbara Rossi aspect of the exhibition, and the recent gift by the Kohler Foundation totally informed the way that we organize those galleries. Without those gifts, it's hard to imagine what that part of the exhibition would have even looked like.
Yeah, for sure. So a number of things aligned at a very specific moment in time, and I think that's what produced this exhibition. So the Christina Ramberg retrospective was being planned at the same time, as Stephanie mentioned, that we received all these gifts and made acquisitions from various families, estates, and foundations, including from Evelyn Statsinger, Ted Halkin, and Barbara Rossi. And Mark, when he approached Stephanie and me about this exhibition, he had this sort of inkling about their connection to one another. And so it became mine and Stephanie's mission to figure out, exactly what that connection was. And it led us down this treasure trove of insight, finding documentation and these materials that really materialized their relationships to one another, whether that was as peers, as colleagues, as you mentioned, Mark, and even as friends. And so we have a few slides showing those connections. Mark mentioned that one of the acquisitions we made were of exquisite corpse drawings, which, for those of you who don't know, exquisite corpse was a sort of surrealist game where for every member who was playing, you would fold a piece of paper that many times, and it was your responsibility as a group to develop a body without knowing what preceded it. And so we have these drawings that really testified to their friendship, where these sorts of drawings would be made before or after dinner at somebody's house. And then another form of relationship that we saw emerge in our research was as peers, as mentors and mentees. The images we have here are drawings by Evelyn Statsinger and Christina Ramberg, who developed this really beautiful relationship. And Ramberg came to see Statsinger as a sort of mentor figure, and you can see the ways that their work plays on each other and how they were inspired by each other. And then this also led us down a lot of archival research. This is from Christina Ramberg's estate. We found a lot of exhibition ephemera, so postcards, posters that had lists of artists involved, and this is a really special one where you can see that all 4 of the artists exhibited together in this exhibition. So despite their 20-year age difference, they were all peers making artwork at the same time, showing together.
And if I could just insert one small thing there, Kat. Another thing worth touching on is the fact that I'm sure many of you have gotten a chance to also see the Christina Ramberg retrospective that's going on concurrently with our exhibition. The Ramberg retrospective came first, but this was a great opportunity to think about, you have a retrospective exhibition, you get one kind of view of an artist, right? I mean, you get to see a lot of different works by a single artist and get an understanding of their career. But what you sometimes miss out on is understanding the giant network that most artists are a part of and that they participate in, and a kind of organic community that can form around artists, especially Chicago artists. And that became a huge theme of the exhibition, was thinking about these webs of connections between people, like Kat said, that very special and not being hierarchical, and being able to show 2 artists from an earlier generation, Ted Halkin and Evelyn Statsinger, and put them in comparison with and in conversation with Rossi and Ramberg, allows us to tell a very intergenerational story that is not simply hierarchical top-down, but is about an ongoing conversation that was happening in Chicago at the time.
Do you want to talk about the rest?
Yeah, absolutely. So as Kat mentioned, we were able to visit a number of really important archives in the course of our research and uncover new and interesting findings as a result of that. We had the opportunity to go to the Kohler Foundation, which at the time housed Barbara Rossi's archive. And that was a real treat for a researcher like me, because Rossi is kind of an archivist's dream. She literally saved everything. Yeah, so the fact that we had 2 days was a challenge because we found that we had like 100 bankers' boxes of stuff to go through, impossible to go through everything. But as we were looking through boxes, we found lots of really interesting evidence to support the themes that we were developing, but also to enrich our own object files. So for example, on the screen here, I'm just showing a photograph of an image of a photograph that we found in the archives. And as you can see, the photograph is the original version of the image that Rossi then mediated between and on different levels, and the image that you see on the right is in our exhibition. So, this is a perfect example of something that when you do this kind of research, you find out new things about the works that already exist in your own collection, and that's really, really exciting for people like us.
The last slide I have here are some of the more tender findings from our archival research. These were personal photographs that belonged to Evelyn Statsinger. Is this your left, I think? It's a photo of Halkin and Statsinger, where they had a yearly tradition of celebrating Thanksgiving together. And then the other photo are Polaroids of Christina Ramberg, Phil Hansen, and Alex Hansen at the Statsinger-Cohen house in Allegan, Michigan. What was that? Oh, sorry, Phil Hansen. I'm not sure what I said, but Phil Hansen.
There's a lot of names. And this is another great photograph of Barbara Rossi, Christina Ramberg, several other people, including a very well-known, maybe known to some of you, professor at SAIC named Rei Yoshida, who was extremely influential for this group of artists. And you get a sense from looking at this photograph of them at an exhibition at the MCA by the artist Eva Hesse of just how kind of tight-knit SAIC was as a community at this time, how the boundaries of the institution expanded to include lots of different kinds of relationships, lots of different kinds of artistic engagement beyond what we might think of as typical or occurring within the classroom. And I mean, the AIC collection was also a huge, huge part of that. We highlight in our exhibition just how important our very own Art Institute's collection was to these artists. It's very exciting to get to tell such a personal kind of story about Chicago in a way that sometimes we don't get to do.
Truth. Could you guys talk a little bit about, you've sort of hinted at it, but talk more about why these particular artists made sense in the end? I mean, we picked them, but we had to kind of prove it, We, as you said, I had an inkling. I actually had more than an inkling, but it was actually a fun project for you guys to really flesh out.
Yeah, well, I think a major component of all of their work is drawing. I think a lot of these artists are remembered not as draftspeople or printmakers. They're actually remembered for painting and sculpture, their textile work. But they all use drawing as testing grounds, as a site of experimentation. And I think that we both found that through their drawings, you could see the aesthetic and, thematic continuities throughout all of their work.
Absolutely. And also, I think it's nice, again, when you have a group of artists together, you see this sense of a shared interest in a certain type of formal exploration. But also you see how they all engaged in different ways with, for example, drawing. For Rossi, it really became something that at certain moments in her practice was a very important end in and of itself for her, whereas someone like Ramberg tended to use drawing as a kind of beginning stage for her paintings. And then you have Statsinger that's somewhere in between, Halkin perhaps somewhere in between, although the works that we mostly highlight in our exhibition tend to be more finished works.
Yeah, I think that's another really interesting part about their works on paper is that even though they used it as sort of sometimes a starting place, they all had highly stylized, highly finished works. So our next slide here is of Ted Halkin's work. I think this also speaks to something that Stephanie brought up earlier about this non-hierarchical approach to artwork. I think Ted Halkin is such an incredible example of this. So prior to making these drawings, Halkin was making paintings and like constantly finding ways to make two-dimensional surfaces three-dimensional. So he started off making these earth tone paintings when he was doing his BFA and even his MFA in art, that then became relief paintings, that then became anthropomorphic furniture. And he had said that his hands couldn't work as fast as his mind went, and so he turned to drawing as a way to constantly produce new work. And something that I find really interesting about these drawings in particular is that there's this exuberance to them that didn't necessarily exist in his earlier work that I personally think is informed by his interest in student work. Around the time that he's making these drawings, he began teaching at SAIC, and that same year, the Harry who made extremely raucous, exuberant work, was showing at Hyde Park Art Center for the first time. And this is the first time that I really had seen this like explosion of color come out in his work. And I also have this slide here that I felt directly referenced a Harry Who painting, this painting by Art Green. So yeah, to your point earlier about non-hierarchy, I think that Ted Halkin's especially a great example because he was also this like great student of art history, a professor of art history, and all of these artists are constantly looking to, the greats, in their work, as all artists do. But Halkin and the rest of these artists are also looking at people who are up and coming, emerging artists, at students who might not necessarily have that sort of credence yet.
In addition to self-taught artists, comic books, kinds of popular culture that are not considered to be high art, I think you could think about this idea of non-hierarchical interest or investment and being shared amongst these artists in various ways. You can think about it the ways we've already talked about. You can also think about it in terms of their interests in exploring various media and not privileging certain types of media over others and their practice necessarily, and just in terms of their sources. They were totally omnivorous as a group of artists, just interested in seeing and absorbing as much as they possibly could. And that really informed each of these four artists really had an investment in constantly exploring, constantly experimenting, in finding what we there's a term that we used a lot when we were talking about this exhibition in our conversations early on, and it does recur in the galleries a fair amount, this idea of form invention. And that was a term that Barbara Rossi wrote about a lot. She talked about it a lot in interviews. She taught classes called form invention. But we found that it was a really interesting way of talking about the formal similarities between these artists, the artistic similarities that they had in their work, an interest in doing observation of the world, but moving beyond direct observation and what they recorded in their various media, thinking about a kind of subjective vision of the world, thinking about how we all bring subjectivity to our view of the world and in what we translate into art forms.
Yeah, totally. And I think Statsinger's work is a really great example of this. She made this probably when she was a student, but I wanted to bring this slide in particular because I found a really funny quote that she had when I was doing my research. So she showed an aptitude for art at a really young age, and she went to a high school completely dedicated to the arts, and she said that she took academic drawing classes that really bored her because they would have to do a lot of representational rendering. And she said that she remembered having to draw a head, and she was like, what's even the point? It can't even talk. And so I really love this image, thinking about that quote in mind, right? Because it has so much personality to it, and I think this really speaks to what you're saying about form invention being, you're looking at a direct source, but there's a subjective attitude about it.
Absolutely. And they all, Another thing that they really shared and that made it really easy and exciting to work on this exhibition is that they were all very reflective about their practices. They were all very thoughtful about the way that they talked about their practices and reflected on why they made things that looked like they did. So these quotes from Evelyn Statsinger are a perfect example of that.
Could that be an aspect of the importance of humor in their work also?
Yeah,
You guys want to talk about humor in their work at all?
You don't, in a fancy art museum, sometimes humor gets like a little lost in our interpretation and in the galleries, doesn't it? But it's great to work on artists like this because they all really put that humor like front and center and made it a part of the work as well as the way that they talked about it. Thank you for pulling these up, Ken. Yes, so probably my favorite title in the exhibition, Character Formed by the Heavenly Hot Dog, on the screen to your right. This is a perfect example of Rossi's idea of form invention. She basically would start without any preconceived idea of what she was going to do when she started with these types of drawings that she made at this point in her career. And she would start with a single form, elaborate that, and only then allow herself to move on to other parts of the paper until she felt that the composition was complete without any preconceived idea. And then she would name it after the fact. And I think it's interesting that a lot of times the titles that they choose to use are very playful, very humorous, full of wordplay and, interest in... Yes, pun. They love a good pun. And who among us doesn't?
Yeah, I think Ted Halkin and Evelyn Statsinger are a little different. Their work isn't as overtly humorous as, say, Barbara Rossi's generation or the Harry Hughes generation. And I think part of that is because of the time that they're going to school. Both of them attended SCIC after World War II.
No laughing.
No laughing, yeah, none. No joy there, yeah. But...
a more austere moment.
It really was. And I think this moment in particular is especially interesting because art schools, arts programs saw possibly the highest levels of enrollment at the time, or I guess ever, because of the GI Bill. So people like Ted Halkin, some of his peers in that cohort as well, were attending art school because of the GI Bill. And I thought this was interesting because during this moment of global upheaval, a lot of people are turning to art and culture as a way to contend with this cruelty of the world, of having to reckon with what humans are capable of doing to one another. And so a lot of the work that came out during that time had to deal with gruesome or destructive imagery, coloring, things of that nature. And so Ted and Evelyn, I think, their subject matter, at least early on when they were in school, tended to be more esoteric, dealt with personal mythologies of their own making based on these sources that they would find in places like the Field Museum or our own galleries here at the Art Institute.
The one thing I would add to that, though, just because I'm looking at our little screen, and maybe we could pull up the slide of Evelyn Statsinger's sketchbooks. I think that her sketchbooks, which we have in the exhibition, are a really great example of how she could blend those things together and hold multiple ideas together in her mind. And those sketchbooks are very playful, the ones with the cutouts. But they also, if you look through them, it's really the way that she's kind of playing with the way that your perception of what you expect to see when you turn that page, and the cutout is different than what you think it's going to be. But also when you actually look through the sketchbooks, there are many very disturbing images in them. It kind of alternates between sort of humorous, strange, surreal images and images that are very overtly of war, of death, of destruction. She was really good at holding those things in conversation with each other in interesting ways.
Absolutely, yeah. These sketchbooks, so the one on I'm sorry, I'm not sure which direction, but this one is her 1968 sketchbook, which she made in response to the learning about the Vietnam War. She was living in Japan at the time, and so a lot of the imagery in this sketchbook in particular is inspired by costumes, traditional Japanese theater, and she uses those as inspiration to develop the forms and the characters that are in this book. But as you flip through, as Stephanie was saying, some of the imagery is really gruesome. But I also think that, to an earlier point that you made, of these works being extremely finished, I think her sketchbooks are also an incredible example of that. Because if you think about a sketchbook, like you're thinking of like a few like hashed lines, you know, like you're thinking about people forming ideas, but these books read as gestalt items that feel thought through from beginning to end before she even begins.
And I mean, that's a great example of how all four of these artists liked to play with viewers' expectations and expectations about what a certain form of art might look like and do. And kind of get us thinking about what is this really? What could this be? And another thing that you said made me want to highlight too, that another interesting connection that these artists all shared and that we reflected on a lot is their interest in travel and the way that travel and experiencing different cultures really informed all of their practices. Are you going for the one? I think, yeah. So this is a really, really beautiful work by Barbara Rossi that we highlight in the galleries, one of the many wonderful gifts from the Kohler Foundation. And this she made after she spent she was very, very interested in Indian painting traditions, both historical and current. And she spent a lot of time, she first became interested in them by looking at Mughal miniatures in the Art Institute's collection, which used to be permanently on display, much to the horror of maybe some of the paper conservators amongst us. But she loved to go look at those works, and she became really interested in them during her time as a student at SAIC. But then she also went on to travel to India. She did a fellowship there. She spent 6 months in the 1980s, and she came back and she kind of metabolized a lot of what she had learned into a group of paintings where you can really see overt references to what she saw, but also, importantly, balancing references. She talked a lot about, from this particular group of works, talked about the importance of Sienese painting, so like Italian Renaissance era type painting, and lots of other influences that came together for her, lots of different historical and geographical periods that she kind of brought together.
Mark, I hope you don't mind. I'd like to ask Stephanie a question.
Oh, avant-garde.
Well, so I'm looking at Barbara Rossi's slides here, right? And I think that this is something that also characterizes all four artists, is this intensity about their work, right? Like Barbara Rossi produced so many versions of the same thing, and I was wondering if you could talk more about that.
Oh yeah, so yeah, that is such a good point. We haven't really touched on that, but all of these artists were quite obsessive. I was just rereading an interview that Barbara Rossi did where she talked about, even as a child, her mother telling her that she was being way too much a perfectionist, and her saying that she just could not help it. And you really get a sense of that when you're in her archives about everything that she obsessively documented and saved. And after this, we should definitely go to Evelyn's large-scale drawings to talk about that level of obsession. But this is a great example of, as you see on the far right, an absolutely beautiful print that is in the Art Institute's collection, 15th century German print, that Rossi saw as a student and then continued to come back and look at as a professor and just as a artist living in Chicago, of Jesus Christ as a man of sorrows, and then turn that into this very playful, interesting exploration in a series that she called Mail of Sorrows, and she had many different versions of it, and it allowed her to experiment with different, that's sovereign, that's not, but similar, and she kind of extrapolated out from the original image that had inspired her to something that, if you didn't know that was the inspiration, you probably wouldn't necessarily think of that to look at it. But she also was able to use that same image, that same form, to experiment across media. She was an incredibly talented printmaker and did all of these prints herself, it's important to point out. And to print that kind of a print on fabric is no mean feat. The level of obsession, to talk about obsession, that it would take to print that type of print, which is inked in a technique called a la poupée, which involves using wads of fabric and putting a single color with a single wad of fabric and dabbing it onto the printing plate, and then running it through the press, creating essentially a single image, and you have to start all over again. And she would print these on paper, she would print them on fabric, she would sew them, and they all look her level of perfectionism is quite remarkable. They're all technically perfect, basically.
Yeah, and if anybody sews or works with fabric, you know how finicky fabric is. It's very difficult to work with. And so this is why I like your decision of including that one textile where it's crumpled up because it got jammed in the printer. But when you see the ones that are completely flat, you'd think, that's really easy, you know, but it's quite difficult to work with fabric.
Yeah, and one of the nice things about having such a rich collection to draw on is you can kind of see versions of where people were working, experimenting with different types of techniques, different styles, and seeing what worked and what didn't work, and coming up with pretty amazing final products.
I think it's interesting, and I don't know if you all noticed this, but traditionally in printmaking, the idea is that you have an original multiple. So you have a print that comes from a matrix that you marked on, and the edition would be pretty much the same throughout, as close to the same as possible. It's hard to do when you're inking a la poupée, but it's possible. We haven't talked about repetition at all, which is a part of the ethos of printing an edition. But the thing that it's always cracked me up about Barbara, particularly after seeing the little film clip that you found, is that her quilts were printed in repetition. It's like the same plate in a pattern over and over and over again. But then that's not enough. She goes back and she stitches over the etched lines that have printed. So it's like many layers of repetition. And I don't know if you came up with any thoughts about that at the end. Maybe not.
To me, I feel like it fits. I mean, to me, that way of working fits so much with her approach to art in general. It doesn't strike me as surprising or unnatural because it so fits in with the way that she thought about her own work, which is to say that she always worked in this way that was kind of attendant to originality. You know, she would make these series of drawings, and each drawing is unique, but they all fit into a very specific way of working in a very distinct series. And then when she had kind of done enough of that, she would move on to something else. I feel that she was always pushing herself and trying out different types of ways of making an image, a work of art, just feel a little bit different, a little bit extra special, even though so much of her work is repetitive and she tries a lot of times to be sort of technically perfect in that repetition. She would often end up making things that felt very unique and really not like anything else, even if, you know, a quilt is full of images that are sort of repeats of each other. She's done other things to them to make it feel like a unique single object that exists in its own space, even with that repetition within it.
Yeah, I think it's just my geekiness about printmaking that makes me think that way. But I also think that when you think about the display of those objects, both on paper and on fabric, and how the same plate gets printed on many different things, and you get the feeling for how pressure, surface, resistance, absorption, and all of those factors play into her curiosity. I think curiosity, I mean, we haven't talked about that at all, but I think that's sort of a backbone for all of these artists, that it drives them, it drives their tendencies to return and repeat and revisit and to try again. And I don't know if you want to talk about that at all with someone like Ramberg or any of the other artists, but I think it's maybe a few words about that, if you have any thoughts.
I think not about the returning part, but rather the moving forward part, I think is really interesting, especially with Statsinger and Halkin, because their styles had changed so drastically throughout their life. And this is why I think drawing is really important in their practices, is because that's where you see the continuities. But from where they began to where they ended, their styles have changed. But I think that speaks to their sort of artistic restlessness. Like, this made it a bit difficult for them to keep a gallery, is because part of, having a gallery is that you're making work that sells. And when a certain style sells really well, your gallerist might want you to keep making that, And they were so dedicated to constantly pushing themselves, learning new media, trying new things out, and that is sort of what propelled their artistic careers forward, is this intense dedication to themselves and what their personal interests were in finding out what their creative path would be.
But to your point, Mark, I would add too that I think they all felt that a continued openness and curiosity to what new things they might discover in the world, that was kind of not just a way of being, it was absolutely a chosen way of working, that they felt that this was fundamental to the way that they all saw themselves as artists. Rossi had this really great quote that I found where she talked about being a connoisseur of her own visual experience. And I think that you could say that they all were constantly connoisseurs of their own visual experiences and gaining new repertoires of images, keeping, a lot of them. Ramberg absolutely was a huge record keeper of slides, of notes about art that she had seen, doodles. Rossi also did the same thing. I'm not sure if Statsinger and Halkin did, but maybe you know.
Not as much, actually. Yeah, Halkin didn't write much at all, and Statsinger would write letters, but they didn't keep records in the same way as fastidious as Ramberg and Rossi.
Yeah, well, Ramberg and Rossi, fastidious, but also to the point of obsession sometimes.
Yeah, Christina Ramberg I remember when we opened those boxes, there was old chip bags from the 70s that she was keeping as artistic reference.
Yeah, they had wonderful designs on them. I think that's why she kept them. Yeah. But I'm also thinking about, in terms of this business about elliptical thinking, particularly with Barbara. I don't think you brought a slide of it, but for those of you who've seen the show, you've seen in the gallery where we have the early drawings from the late 60s with pencil. There's also the photographs of driftwood, which happened 2 decades later.
Yeah. Even more, because the drawings were from the 60s and the photographs are from early 2000s. So we're talking about almost closer to 40 years of time. It's such a good point about elliptical way of working and thinking. That is so characteristic of Barbara. But yeah, so as Mark mentioned in the exhibition, there are some really cool photographs that Barbara took of pieces of driftwood that she found and collected just in I think it was in Michigan that she started finding and collecting these. And she said that she started taking photographs of them because she didn't think anyone would believe her that that's what they looked like if she didn't photograph them. But they reminded her of these heads that she had made in the 1960s and kind of brought her back to this much earlier, very, formative early stage of her work. But what I love about them too is that they also went in a completely new direction. She's in a totally different medium. She's taking a totally different approach to how she's capturing these images. So she was able to return, but not become repetitive.
It also makes me think about their experiences as students of being taught in the Field Museum or being taught in the Oriental Institute by Whitney Halstead or Kathleen Blackshear for the earlier generation, because those photographs end up looking like ethnographic, studies of something. The thing that we sadly weren't able to show you as an audience is that towards late in the game, after you guys had your gal pal trip to Sheboygan and did the deep dive into Barbara's archive. And you saw those sketchbooks of Barbara's that were in the archive, and the Kohler was very wise and kind to pull them out and offer them to us as gifts. In one of those sketchbooks, she's got very, very detailed scientific illustrations, practically. That's how detailed they are, drawings of the driftwood things. So I don't know if that happened first or if the photographs happened because maybe she thought that drawings weren't true enough, but the photographs would be truer. But it sort of indicates just how deeply interested she became in that phenomenon, which is another hallmark of her, care in the way that she approached her work. Do you have more to say about them as artists? Or one thing I thought we might spend a couple of minutes on, because we're getting close to the end here, is to talk a little bit about the milieu of Chicago art scene via exhibiting. What was the impetus for some of these incredible group shows that really underscores how supportive they were of each other? And I'm thinking about the first case in the first gallery of Exhibition Momentum. Do you want to talk about the evolution of that? Because that really relates specifically to the school.
We can start with these. Yeah. So way back when, the Art Institute used to have the Chicago and Vicinity Show, which was specifically to show artists based in the Chicagoland area. And in 1947, a large majority of those artists included in that exhibition were students. And so older established artists in the area, including professors at SAIC, went to the director at the time, Daniel Kattenrich, and said, "We don't want this anymore. You shouldn't show students anymore." And he said, "Okay." And so the students protested because they were no longer able to participate. And I included a slide here of, this is just one page of however many student signatures. This one has Evelyn Statsinger's name on it, but Ted Halkin also did sign this petition. And in response to being banned from the Chicago and Vicinity Show came about Exhibition Momentum, which is entirely student organized by students at SAIC and what was the Institute of Design, which is now the Illinois Institute of Technology, IIT. And this is the first of what became many self-organized exhibitions by artists in Chicago. So this exhibition in particular expressly stated that this exhibition was intended to showcase artists in Chicago who would otherwise have to look elsewhere for opportunities to exhibit their artwork, because that was something that was really big at the time, was that Chicago's art scene was really hostile to Chicago artists. There wasn't a lot of institutional support for artists in general, but younger artists in particular. And I think this is actually something that Chicago continues to suffer from today, is that it continues to be an incubator for incredible talent that has to leave Chicago in order to experience artistic validation elsewhere, and that is when their careers take off. And so this exhibition started one of many group exhibitions, like I mentioned, that was intended only to support Chicago artists. I don't know, do you want to talk some more about the false image show, or maybe Chicago marriage style?
Well, I mean, I guess what I would say is that, as Kat pointed out, this kind of exhibition momentum kind of was a impetus in itself for a different way of thinking about how artists in Chicago could get their work seen, because they didn't have the institutional support. And
there was also a lack of commercial galleries. Let's not forget that.
Yes, thank you, good point. And what they came up with was a kind of do-it-yourself let's pull together, pool our resources, and create a sort of outside of the norm community of artists that could exhibit together, support one another, support each other's work. And for Barbara Rossi, it meant everything to her career. Some of her earliest exhibitions were basically other artists that sort of worked in similar veins, kind of reaching out to her and saying, "Hey, do you want to exhibit with us in this particular show that we're doing?" And here's a great example of an early show that she did, Marriage Chicago Style, at the Hyde Park Art Center. The Hyde Park Art Center was a really important space for the people in Rossi's generation that we're talking about. And you can see here what I love about this photograph is this was like the promotional photograph for the exhibition. And you get such a sense, again, of the humor that they brought even to their exhibition style, to the way that they worked together. So they would just kind of form these loose collectives of artists to show together because they had something in common formally, because for various other reasons, and find ways to get their work seen. And they would support each other. They would buy each other's work. They would go to each other's shows. It became a really important source of...
It was an incubator.
Yeah. I think the other important thing to point out here, too, is the fact that showing your work isn't the only thing that'll get you that sort of validation as an artist. Writing is a big component of that as well. And for Ted Halkin and Evelyn Statsinger, their classmate, Franz Schulz, actually went on to become a very famous art critic. And he is one of the people who put them on the map under the moniker Monster Roster, referring to what I mentioned earlier of these sort of more gruesome or esoteric or difficult themes of this post-war generation who was coming through SAIC, although they did not like that name. It was named after... the Monsters of the Midway, is that right? Yeah, the Bears, yeah.
There was a Chicago twist to it, even though they were all sort of making existential images of people. Yeah.
I mean, it's very interesting because these artists have been called by many names, and we continue to apply many names to them. And they never liked any of them. So why are we still doing that? But I mean, it's interesting because a lot of these artists still get grouped under the term imagist, and I myself am guilty of occasionally using that as a shorthand to describe a sort of set of shared aesthetic investments. But these artists always, even though they had this sense of a communal and common sensibility, shared investments, really didn't like this idea of being grouped under this sort of simplistic version of how they came together, what their similarities were. They really rejected this idea and said that it was a family. It was a family feeling, but it was a family where everyone was doing their own thing and working in their own direction. And the idea of simply slapping this moniker on them and thinking that it does the job of explaining the nuances between the various artists, they were often very frustrated by.
Yeah, it didn't afford them their own personal artistic identity.
And again, it's true too that a lot of times they came together to exhibit together for other more practical reasons. And so it wasn't necessarily that they were working under one roof and thinking about all the same things. It's just that when they came together and needed to exhibit, it was easier to do so if you kind of found a group of like-minded people that you could show with.
Not only that, but I think the initial group show that happened at the Hyde Park Art Center, and it was not just the artist, it was also the impresario of the Hyde Park Art Center, Don Baum, who was sophisticated and open enough to allow them a lot of sovereignty in selecting the exhibit and who to exhibit with. The person in the first iteration that he added he suggested that they add Carl Worsom, which they did, and we're happy to. But the idea was that they presented their idea as a group exhibition, but because there were so few of them and the space was so large, they were able to pack in literally the equivalent of as many artists as there were one-person exhibitions. And so sometimes they had walls that blended their work, but often they just had walls that was just their work. And they exhibited without hierarchy. They exhibited drawings next to paintings. They created comic book catalogs. A hallmark of that was that they all made their own promotional materials because they knew that no one else was going to do it for them. So it was very self-made. And I'd say that today's apartment galleries and artist-run spaces that stretch back to the 60s and are still going, you said people leave, I think they stay, and they do this because they can. And it's because of that mutual interest in each other and support and the desire to survive that they do it. And I think it's a platform that is curious to more than just artists. I think they get good traction and good foot traffic through it. I don't think they make a lot of sales, but it's inspirational and it's sort of nurturing to them, nutrient-rich, because they're talking to each other. Do you have any other thoughts about any of the points we've been making, or should we take some questions? What do you think?
I'm good to take some questions.
Me too, yeah.
Are there any questions? If you do have a question, if you would wait and raise your hand and wait until someone comes with a microphone.
That takes the fun out of it. I love those sketchbooks. I thought they were more like artist books of Evelyn Statsinger.
Absolutely.
Especially
I think
the video
same.
where you go through page by page and see all the cutouts. And
All Stephanie.
that was great. It was just wonderful to really experience the sketchbook that way. And I ended up seeing the Ellis Chattel show at the Hyde Park Art Center. I don't know if you had a chance to catch that, but there was a series of sketchbooks that she did that were cutouts the exact same way from the exact same time period as what Evelyn Statsinger did. And I'm
So interesting.
And I'm just curious if there's any connection, overlap. Was there something happening with
Well,
people?
sure. They all knew each other. And you know, they looked at each other's work, and I'm not being funny. I mean, it's true. It's and also she was married to Don Baum, and Don, you know, there's so much capillary interaction between these artists, and I think even Phil Hansen did workbooks. I don't really call them sketchbooks. I call them those are the things I call workbooks. I think it's also good to call them artist books because they're complete thoughts in themselves. Mm-hmm. They're narratives. And they're generally visual narratives, but they're narratives. And
it was just fascinating to see two similar styled artists' books by two different artists who knew each other, of course, from the community, just haphazardly without knowing it was just a chance that I saw it here and saw it there and said, oh, there must be this connection.
I loved that they displayed all of her cards that she made for her dear friend on that table that she worked at. We have our sketchbooks in a museum-y vitrine. They sort of made it real life, and that's how they were made and how they were intended. And I think that when you can do that and get that kind of feeling from it, it's quite remarkable. So I'm glad that you saw that.
Where did they get this idea? Was there some impetus to start these sketchbooks that were almost like, I think of it as children's books, where there was the flip through the pages and each page references the page after it? Where'd they get that from?
I suspect in Evelyn's case that she was very familiar with the Japanese tradition of making books that were narrative, and they were narrative through the formal invention of them. And we have quite a few of them here in the collection at the Art Institute. And when you see them, an artist like Chris Ware, one of the greatest graphic artists of our time, has spent a lot of time studying those, and you can really see it in his comic panels, the way that he develops them. It's really very influenced by the Japanese way of making narrative visual pictures without text. And I think that may have informed Evelyn. She spent a lot of time in Japan, and I suspect that she probably saw that material and would have known it quite well.
I would also add traditional Japanese theater. She was a big fan and went to a lot of shows, and I got to look through some of her slides of photos that she took during her travels. And if you look at the set design, it's this sort of, foreground, middle ground, background. And I think she was really interested in that perspective as well.
We have a question up front here.
I'm curious how working on this exhibition and learning about these artists has informed each of your own work or other projects that you're working on.
Oh.
We work on really different things than
Fair
this
job.
material, actually.
It's been great. Well, I can say for me personally, it's been a great project because, as Mark noted in the introduction, my specialization is the 19th and the early 20th centuries. This is well outside of my field of expertise. So getting to kind of expand my worldview and also think about the ways that the traditions that I study lived on after them and informed artists in very interesting ways. Rossi was hugely influenced by a number of European 19th and early 20th century artists, and you see evidence of that in the galleries. James Ensor, Duchamp, a whole laundry list of great modernist artists, surrealists, French surrealists, the European surrealists were hugely important. And I was thinking about surrealist games with Evelyn Statsinger's sketchbooks too. Something about them makes me think of like surrealist games and things like that too.
I think for me, the most interesting connection that I've found in how it affects my work, which I study Asian American art, one is the connection with Miyoko Ito, who was really, really good friends with Evelyn Statsinger and who had also gone to SAIC. And something I've gotten to study Miyoko Ito in my current work, and something I really admire about her work as a painter is her use of color to create these sort of psychic interiors. Her paintings all have this mood to them because of her treatment of the paint and then also the colors that she chooses. And I think this is something that greatly affects Statsinger too in her own paintings as well. But that was an interesting connection for me, was getting to see, their influence on one another and then that showing up again in my own work. And then also, Bay Area funk is what it's called in the Bay Area. And then here, I guess, Chicago imagism or Chicago style, seeing those connections in I'm based in the Bay now, so getting to see, the Chicago connection in the Bay Area was also really interesting for me.
One more thing I just was thinking of while you were talking that I wanted to add is, I think at the time that these artists were making work, there were a lot of artistic communities that they were being compared to, such as in New York, that were quite competitive and very difficult if you were a woman artist in particular. And Rossi, for example, was always insistent that the Chicago scene was much more of a community, was much more welcoming to women artists, that they didn't feel discriminated against in the same way that women artists did in New York at the time. And I think that it's a really good reminder that, without wanting to be too rah-rah, that it is possible to just not accept a status quo somewhere else, to build your own different kind of community and be more supportive to each other and still be really successful. They were all really successful artists that managed to live their whole lives as working artists and sustain themselves that way. And it was possible to do that without being cutthroat about it.
I think just also generally, I invited these two women to work on this exhibition with me because I knew it was totally different from what they were focused on. And I think both of them are interested in museum careers, and one of the hallmarks of a museum career is that you end up doing what you didn't expect. And so you have to be willing to expand and contract and work on projects that are not your forte, and it just always, no matter what it is, it adds something to your scholarly acumen and your ability to dig deep, and you find new resources, new ways of doing it. And so they had to kind of figure that out. I don't think I really helped you very much.
Oh, I don't know about that.
Did. Are you kidding?
I would disagree.
I sat back and watched two great people work. But I think that's one of the takeaways from an experience like this. It's been my whole life. I think every time I do something, it's something different. It's something new. Yeah.
But I mean, I think, again, I'm in danger of getting too sentimental here, but I feel that one of the things that these at least that I know from Rossi writing about her own teaching, that she tried to do was help artists figure out their own path forward without influencing them too much. And this was such a great opportunity to get to do that for us as curators.
Anyone else?
We have one final question right here in the middle.
So you kind of answered. I was going to ask about their commercial success. I'm wondering, outside of the collectives, did they have art dealers? And I know Phyllis Kind in the 60s represented some of these artists, but 70s. So who represented them in the earlier years, or was it all the collective?
In the earlier years, for both Ted Halkin and Evelyn Statsinger, was Alan Frumpkin. Later on, Jan Cicero as well, Phyllis Kind.
Richard Gray sometimes.
Yeah, and Rossi was represented by Phyllis Kind for most of her career, but then Corbett versus Dempsey, I know, has been involved in representing her in some capacity. It was more recently.
I also will add that this isn't gallery representation, but Statsinger actually got a lot of institutional validation early on in her career, right out of undergrad. She was already showing at the Art Institute because she caught the eye of Kathryn Cua, who was the first modern contemporary art curator here, who at the time when she was showing in the Prints and Drawings galleries here, Cua was actually the director of interpretation, and she convinced Carl Schneewen, who was the curator in Prints and Drawings, to put on solo shows of her work, which happened in both 52 and 57.
And it's also important to know that even though they were all working artists, 3 of them were longtime professors at SAIC as well. So they were practicing while also teaching and getting financial support that way by teaching. But they really, that wasn't a consolation prize for them, though. They really, the 3 artists, Ramberg, Rossi, and Halkin, who taught, really were very invested in their teaching and felt that it was an integral aspect of their practice as artists as well.
In closing, I would like to point out that we had tremendous cooperation from several other departments within the museum because we needed to show these artists across media. And it often is the case that we don't get to see that in the permanent collection galleries because they're more focused on media. But I would especially like to call out the Department of Textiles, which was willing to go with us and accept a lot of gifts from the Kohler Foundation when they weren't even aware of Barbara's work in quilts and printing on fabric, which turned out to be a really beneficial relationship. Also, Department of Modern and Contemporary Art and the Photography Department were very willing partners in loaning us things quite easily. And not least, the archives of the Art Institute of Chicago as part of Ryerson and Burnham Libraries is always essential to every exhibition that happens in this place, whether we exhibit their work or not. It's our great resource, and we're very grateful for it. Thank you all very much for coming.